On the 23rd of December 1944, in the freezing confusion of the Ardennes fighting, a German officer watched a problem become a catastrophe in less time than it should have taken for any normal army to react. His men were trying to move under pressure. The roads were crowded. Orders were being passed in fragments. Vehicles were edging through mud and winter choke points. Then American aircraft appeared overhead, low and sudden, at exactly the moment the ground situation was already turning unstable. What struck him was not only the violence of the attack, it was the timing. The air power did not feel separate from the battle below. It felt attached to it, as if the troops on the ground had reached upward and pulled the aircraft down onto the road with a wire he could not see. That was the part many German officers kept coming back to in reports, recollections, and post-war analysis. The Americans did not always look elegant. They did not always move with the polished surface confidence the Germans had once expected from their own pre-war image of command. But again and again, when the fighting tightened and the battlefield became confused, American ground troops and American aircraft seemed able to find each other faster than they should. One arm reached for the other. One problem became everybody's problem. A pinned platoon, a spotted column, a village held too long, a crossroads exposed at the wrong hour, and suddenly, the sky itself was participating in the same argument. If you like serious WW2 history told clearly, subscribe now, because this is one of those stories where the deeper answer is even more unsettling than the opening scene. For German officers, that speed of coordination felt deeply wrong, not morally wrong, mechanically wrong. Armies were supposed to take time to respond. Information was supposed to move through layers. A local threat was supposed to remain local for at least a little while. Even strong armies had friction. Even efficient command systems had delay. But over and over, American air-ground cooperation seemed to erase part of that delay. A German movement, seen at the wrong moment, could draw artillery, then fighter bombers, then armored pressure, then renewed infantry action, all as part of one continuous problem. To the men on the receiving end, it could feel less like separate blows and more like a single machine turning one wheel after another, and that is why this subject matters. We are not talking about propaganda posters or broad myths about Allied air power. We are talking about what professional enemies wrote when they tried to explain a battlefield experience that kept repeating itself. They wrote about aircraft, yes. They wrote about strafing, bombs, rockets, and constant harassment from above. But beneath that was a larger point, and that point is the reason their testimony still matters. Many German officers were describing a battlefield in which American troops on the ground did not merely receive help from the air. They operated inside a combat system that could link local ground contact to fast aerial violence with a consistency that was strategically exhausting. Think about what that means from inside a command post. You do not just fear enemy planes. You fear being noticed by an enemy army that knows how to turn sight into action. You fear the possibility that any unit touching the Americans may be touching more than the men in front of it. It may be touching radios, artillery nets, tactical aircraft, staff procedures, road control, fuel supply, replacement structures, and a culture of command that expects support to be called, adjusted, and delivered. That changes how you move. It changes when you move. It changes whether you dare to mass vehicles, whether you trust daylight, whether you linger near an exposed edge of a village, whether you send reserves forward on the obvious road, whether you pull back now or gamble on another hour. The pressure is physical first, then it becomes psychological, then it becomes operational. German officers were not blind to air power before they met the Americans at full strength. The Wehrmacht had built its early war reputation on coordination, shock, timing, and the close relationship between movement, fire, and command initiative. The German military tradition valued the ability to compress decision and action. That mattered here, because when German officers later wrote with bitterness or reluctant admiration about American air-ground coordination, they were not speaking as men with no frame of comparison. They knew what it meant to connect arms on a battlefield. They knew what it meant to turn speed into advantage. That is partly what made their reaction so striking. In many sectors, at many moments, they felt themselves on the receiving end of a style of war that had taken some of the logic they respected and scaled it into something heavier, broader, and harder to interrupt. The famous image most people carry of Allied air power in Northwest Europe is simple: endless fighter bombers, thunderbolts overhead, Mustangs in the distance, typhoons slashing roads, trucks burning, columns trapped, men diving into ditches. That image is real as far as it goes. Roads did burn, vehicles were hit, daylight movement became dangerous in many places. German troops often describe the sky as hostile territory, but that image alone is too shallow. Aircraft by themselves are not the full answer. Planes can be brave, plentiful, and technically capable, and still fail to matter enough if the system below them is clumsy. The key question is not whether aircraft existed. The key question is how quickly the fighting on the ground could reach them, shape them, direct them, and use their presence as part of a larger sequence. That is the mystery at the center of this story. What exactly were German officers noticing? What did they mean when they wrote with such frustration about American cooperation between air and ground forces? Were they mainly talking about overwhelming numbers? About Allied control of the skies? About radio efficiency? About training? About doctrine? About the simple fact that by late war Germany was battered, underfueled, and strained past its limits? The honest answer is yes, all of those things matter. But the reason their testimony remains valuable is that it keeps pointing toward one larger truth. Numbers alone do not create the feeling that a battlefield has become connected against you. Systems do. A German unit under attack from aircraft suffers damage. A German unit under attack from a coordinated air-ground system suffers something more dangerous than damage. It suffers exposure. Exposure means movement becomes visible. Visible movement becomes targetable. Targetable movement becomes delay. And delay becomes loss of initiative. Once that cycle starts, even disciplined troops can feel the battlefield narrowing around them. The road ahead is unsafe. The road behind is unsafe. Regrouping invites detection. Counterattack risks being caught in the open. Waiting invites artillery. Moving invites aircraft. Orders arrive later than they should, because communications are under strain. Reserves do not simply reinforce. They announce themselves while traveling. A commander stops asking only, "Can I move?" and starts asking, "If I move, how long before the Americans know, and how quickly can they make that knowledge hurt?" This is where German writing on the subject becomes especially revealing. Again and again, officers describe the pressure in terms that go beyond simple air attack. They describe a battlefield where American units seemed able to summon support with alarming speed. They describe the Americans as flexible. They describe them as aggressive in using the air, not as decoration, not as a distant strategic tool, but as a local battlefield instrument. They complain about roads made unusable by fighter bombers. They note the constant interruption of movement. They describe daylight as a hazard. They portray air attack not just as destruction, but as a way of breaking rhythm. And when you put those observations together, you begin to hear something deeper than frustration. You hear recognition. Recognition matters. A defeated officer may complain. A thoughtful defeated officer may diagnose. The second kind is often far more valuable. When professional enemies keep returning to the same explanation, they are giving you a map of what they believed actually mattered. That does not mean every German report was perfectly fair. It does not mean every memoir is equally reliable. Men write under stress. Men remember through the filter of defeat. Men sometimes shift blame upward, downward, or outward, but patterns remain patterns. When different officers, in different places, under different pressures, keep writing about the same combination of speed, responsiveness, communication, and aerial pressure, that repetition deserves attention. Imagine being a battalion commander trying to hold a position while the front line keeps shifting. Your immediate concern is always the same. Who is in contact? Where is the enemy massing? What roads are still open? Where can I move the guns? Can my reserves get forward? Who still has working communication? What is happening on the flank? Now, add another condition. Anything that bunches, pauses, turns around, or exposes itself, may attract American aircraft with disturbing speed. That does not just threaten lives, it disrupts the entire mental order of command. Planning becomes shorter, caution increases, requests become more urgent. Movement shifts to cover, concealment, darkness, or desperation. Your decisions begin to shrink around the sky. And yet the Americans did not seem to German observers like a mystical army. That is important. German officers often wrote with a kind of professional realism about American strengths and weaknesses. They did not always admire American infantry skill in the abstract. They did not always portray American command culture as superior in every single respect. They could be dismissive, even arrogant, in some judgments. But on the matter of bringing weight onto a battlefield through coordination, their tone often sharpened. This was where enemy testimony becomes especially interesting, because it is the kind of respect men give unwillingly. They may criticize the opponent's instincts, discipline, or battlefield habits. But then they describe what happened when that opponent connected radios, artillery, transport, aircraft, and command procedures in the same fight. Their irritation tells you as much as their praise. This is also why the story cannot be reduced to the old cliché that Germany lost because the Allies had more of everything. It is true that material superiority mattered enormously. It mattered in trucks, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, pilot training, and replacement capacity. Anyone pretending otherwise is not being serious. But superior quantity does not automatically produce superior coordination. Many armies have possessed large resources and still used them badly. The American achievement German officers were trying to describe was not just abundance, it was the way abundance had been organized into response. The Americans could be messy in details and still dangerous in result because the structure beneath the battlefield made support more reachable, more routine, and more repeatable. A unit pinned down at the front did not need to win the war by itself. It needed to stay connected long enough for the wider system to begin helping. That is an enormous difference. German officers knew the emotional effect of that difference. It meant the Americans did not always have to solve a local crisis with only local strength. A platoon's fight might remain a platoon's fight for a few minutes, but not for very long if communications held. A roadblock might be a roadblock until artillery entered the discussion. A hedgerow fight might be a hedgerow fight until tactical aircraft were guided onto movement beyond it. A retreat might remain orderly until daylight and radio-linked opposition turned the route into a trap. When German officers wrote about American air-ground coordination, many were really writing about the end of isolation on the battlefield. They were facing an enemy whose local units could, under the right conditions, reach outward and pull in far more than their own immediate firepower. There was another dimension to this, and it may have been the one German officers found most demoralizing of all. The system did not have to be perfect every time to be oppressive overall. American fighter-bombers missed targets, ground units made mistakes, communications broke, weather grounded missions, friendly confusion happened. Every army is made of human beings, and human beings turn plans into approximations, but that did not rescue the Germans from the pattern. The pattern was that even imperfect American coordination produced repeated pressure, and repeated pressure changes behavior whether every blow lands cleanly or not. If you expect aircraft to appear often enough, you disperse sooner. If you expect roads to be watched, you move differently. If you expect any visible concentration to invite trouble, you stop concentrating unless the need is desperate. In that sense, the fear of coordination could be nearly as useful as coordination itself. So when a German officer wrote with frustration about American planes arriving over a battlefield at exactly the wrong moment for German movement, he was often describing more than a dramatic memory. He was describing the battlefield logic of late-war Western combat. The Americans had reached a point where they could make local German decisions expensive very quickly, not always instantly, not magically, but quickly enough, and often enough, to reshape the enemy's sense of time. Time is everything in battle. Time to move, time to regroup, time to reinforce, time to conceal, time to recover from a bad order, time to exploit a success before the other side understands what happened. What German officers increasingly found was that American coordination was eating that time. And once an army starts losing time, it starts losing options. An exposed reserve no longer arrives as a surprise. A daylight movement becomes a wager. A crossroads becomes a liability. A retreat becomes an emergency. A counterattack begins under observation. Staff work grows more frantic because the commander is trying to solve not only the tactical problem in front of him, but the invisible network supporting the Americans behind it. Can the road still be used before aircraft come? Can artillery remain in position long enough to matter? Can headquarters maintain communication under pressure? Can fuel reach the forward elements without being caught? Can wounded be evacuated if the route is watched? Can the next move be made before the Americans expand the fight sideways and upward? These are not abstract questions. These are command questions, and German officers asked them under conditions where the answers were getting worse. This helps explain the emotional texture of their writing. It is rarely romantic. It is rarely theatrical. Often it is dry, compressed, professional, almost cold. That coldness is useful, because it tells you are not reading simple melodrama. You are reading officers trying to account for battlefield experience in terms their profession can respect. They are not saying, "The Americans frightened us because their planes were loud." They are saying, in effect, "The Americans could integrate air power into ground operations in a way that repeatedly damaged our ability to move, concentrate, communicate, and recover." That is a very different statement. One is a complaint, the other is a diagnosis of combat failure under modern conditions. There is also a hidden irony here. Germany had once shocked Europe by seeming to compress firepower, maneuver, and initiative into a single tempo that other armies struggled to match. The early image of German warfare was built around speed, decision, and the ability to combine arms at the point of action. By the later stages of the war in the West, many German officers found themselves describing an American method that had achieved its own version of that compression on a much broader foundation. The Americans were not imitating the Germans in style or personality. Their army felt different. Their officers sounded different. Their institutional culture was different. But they were producing a battlefield result German officers understood immediately. A dangerous enemy had learned how to connect action across multiple arms before the defense could recover. That recognition sits at the center of this story. What German officers wrote about American air-ground coordination matters because enemy testimony can reveal the difference between what looks powerful and what actually functioned powerfully. It is easy, years later, to look at aircraft in photographs and imagine brute force. It is harder, and more useful, to understand why the officers on the ground beneath those aircraft kept writing in the language of timing, interruption, and linked action. They were telling us where the real pressure came from. Not only from bombs and strafing. From a system that could make the Americans' battlefield awareness matter faster than expected. And once you begin to see that, the whole subject changes shape. This is no longer just a story about air superiority. It becomes a story about information, procedure, confidence, and trust. The Americans had built a way of fighting in which ground troops could expect support to be reachable, and in which aircraft could be folded into local combat, often enough to distort enemy decision-making. German officers did not always describe it with those modern words, but they felt the result. They felt it in crowded roads, broken movement, hurried concealment, interrupted reserve deployment, and the constant fear that local contact might call down something much larger than the men directly in front of them. That is why the opening scene matters. One officer, one road, one battlefield moment, one sudden appearance of American aircraft. It is tempting to treat that as a dramatic anecdote and move on. But German officers did not move on. They kept returning to the same problem because it kept returning to them. The same pattern appeared in complaints about movement by day, in frustration over fighter bombers, in analysis of American flexibility, in bitter remarks about radios, in descriptions of pressure that combined artillery, aircraft, and ground attack into one sustained assault on German freedom of action. They were not all writing the same sentence. They were writing around the same wound. And wounds like that are never caused by one weapon alone. They come from structure, they come from preparation, they come from habits built before the battle ever begins. The sky over the battlefield was only the visible surface. Beneath it sat the larger American system that made those aircraft matter the way they did. And before we can understand why German officers wrote with such force about what they faced, we have to go down into that hidden machinery itself. The easiest way to misunderstand this story is to imagine that German officers were mainly reacting to American airplanes, the way civilians react to a storm. A storm arrives. It is violent. It passes overhead. It leaves damage. That image is dramatic, but it is too simple. German officers were not writing like men trapped in weather. They were writing like professionals, trying to explain why an opponent could keep turning local contact into larger danger. The aircraft mattered because they were connected. That connection is the real subject now. When German officers complained about American air-ground coordination, they were often describing a battlefield where air power did not feel distant from the front. It did not feel like a separate war being fought somewhere above them. It felt like an extension of what the Americans were already doing on the ground. That is a very important difference. Many armies can launch aircraft. Fewer can make those aircraft matter consistently to the platoon, company, battalion, and column-level fight. Fewer still can make ground troops behave with the expectation that help from above is part of the normal logic of combat, rather than a rare bonus. The Americans were far from perfect. But by the later phases of the war in Western Europe, they had built enough structure beneath the battlefield to make that expectation real, often enough that German officers felt it. That structure began with a simple but decisive principle. Air power was most dangerous when it could be tied to immediate ground need. That sounds obvious now, but nothing in war is obvious until institutions build around it. An army can believe in cooperation in theory and still fail at it in practice. The problem is never just the airplane. The problem is who sees the target, who reports it, who interprets the report, who decides whether the target matters, who has the authority to ask for support, who speaks the same language of procedure, who has working radios, who knows where friendly troops actually are, who can redirect aircraft already in the air, and who trusts the system enough to use it quickly under stress. If even a few of those links fail, the promise of coordination collapses into delay. This is what German officers were encountering, an opponent that had spent time solving enough of those links to make the chain hold more often than it broke. The Americans did not create a magical battlefield. They created a more connected one. That connectivity came from doctrine, training, equipment, staff habits, command confidence, and sheer organizational persistence. Those things are not glamorous in the way fighter bombers are glamorous. They do not leave cinematic images in the same way burning trucks do, but they are exactly the reason the trucks burned when they did. Start with communications, because communications sit at the center of everything. A ground unit under pressure cannot benefit from aircraft. It cannot reach, cannot identify properly, or cannot guide safely. In the First World War, and even in much of the interwar imagination, this kind of problem was immense. Front lines shifted, maps lagged, radios were limited. Aircraft saw things differently than men on the ground. Identification was dangerous. Delay was natural. By the Second World War, every serious army understood that better battlefield communication mattered. But understanding a problem and solving it are not the same thing. The American advantage was not that radios existed. The German army had radios too. The question was, how widely useful, standardized, integrated, and expected radio communication had become inside the American system. American units, especially by the later war period, operated within a military culture that put extraordinary weight on communication between arms. Radios, signal procedures, liaison practices, and standardized support methods were not decorations. They were part of how the army thought. This mattered because it made requests for help feel procedural rather than exotic. If a ground commander needed support, he was not inventing a private solution from scratch. He was operating inside a system designed to route need, upward, outward, and across. That system did not eliminate confusion. No battlefield ever does. Radios failed. Batteries died. Sets were damaged. Terrain blocked signals. Units got mixed. Pilots misunderstood. Staffs became overloaded. But again, perfection is the wrong standard. German officers were reacting to comparative performance, not to fantasy. They did not need the Americans to be flawless. They only needed the Americans to be fast enough and connected enough, often enough to make movement and regrouping increasingly costly. Think for a moment about how that changes the meaning of frontline contact. In a disconnected army, a local firefight is often just that, local. The men present must carry most of the burden themselves until the higher system catches up. In a connected army, local contact can begin drawing in other arms with much greater speed. A reconnaissance report can sharpen artillery. A halted advance can trigger support. A road movement seen from the ground can be turned into an air problem. A pocket of resistance can be fixed until aircraft arrive. The local fight becomes an entry point into a network. That is one of the deepest reasons German officers wrote the way they did. They could feel the Americans operating inside a networked style of battle before that language ever became fashionable. There was also the matter of command philosophy. American command culture in the European War is often described too loosely, either as rigid and procedural or as casually flexible, depending on who is doing the talking. In reality, it contained both strong structure and meaningful adaptability. That combination is exactly what made air-ground coordination harder to resist. Too much rigidity, and nothing moves fast. Too much improvisation, and the system becomes unsafe, confused, and unreliable. What the Americans built, unevenly but effectively, was a way of fighting in which procedures were standardized enough to support rapid cooperation, while local commanders still retained enough confidence to call, request, redirect, and press for support under pressure. German officers would have recognized the importance of that balance immediately. They came from a military tradition that respected initiative, decision, and the ability to act under uncertainty. What increasingly troubled them in the West was that the Americans were combining their own version of initiative with resources and support structures of great depth. Initiative by itself is dangerous. Initiative, attached to artillery nets, radio links, tactical aircraft, engineer support, motor transport, and logistic capacity, becomes something much harder to contain. That is why German officers so often described American strength not just in terms of power, but in terms of responsiveness. Responsiveness is one of those words that sounds soft until you place it inside combat. On a battlefield, responsiveness means the enemy does not remain static while you act. It means your opening move may already be generating the answer that will hit you. It means that while you are still committing to a road, the other side may already be shaping that road into a trap. It means a resistance point is not merely resisting, it is also transmitting, surviving, orienting, and waiting for reinforcement from systems beyond itself. For German officers trying to move men, vehicles, guns, and supplies through contested areas, American responsiveness was dangerous because it compressed their margin for correction. One of the quiet strengths of the American method was standardization. This is rarely remembered because standardization sounds dull, it sounds bureaucratic, it sounds like paperwork. In reality, on a large battlefield, standardization can be a form of violence. When procedures are known, signals are understood, maps are aligned, terminology is shared, and coordination methods are drilled, time is saved. Saved time becomes faster action. Faster action becomes interrupted enemy movement. Interrupted movement becomes operational breakdown. German officers may not have used the word standardization with admiration, but they felt its effects whenever American support seemed to arrive through practiced channels rather than improvised guesswork. Training mattered here too, not just pilot training, though that was important, not just the training of forward observers or liaison officers, though they mattered greatly. The wider point is that American forces had increasingly learned how to fight as cooperating arms rather than as neighboring institutions. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, tactical air support, and headquarters systems were not always elegant together, but they had been taught to expect one another. That expectation changes behavior. A unit that has trained with support in mind plans differently, reports differently, survives differently, and presses differently. It does not merely hope help might appear. It acts with the assumption that help can be reached. That is the sort of assumption German officers kept encountering to their frustration. There is a question worth asking here. Which is more dangerous in war? An elite unit that performs brilliantly on its own, or an ordinary unit that can quickly call in the strength of a larger system? German officers increasingly discovered that the second kind of enemy can be harder to defeat. Elite units are rare. Systems can be widespread. If average American units could fight with the expectation of support from artillery, air, transport, and command links, then the battlefield did not depend solely on exceptional local genius. It depended on the repeatability of the system. That repeatability is what made American coordination exhausting. German officers were not merely colliding with heroic moments. They were colliding with institutional habits. Tactical air support was one visible expression of those habits. Aircraft did not operate in isolation from planning. Ground forces did not simply wish them into being. There were established methods of requesting strikes, identifying targets, deconflicting friendly positions, and folding aircraft into the unfolding tempo of operations. These methods varied by time, place, weather, command arrangement, and phase of the war. They were not mechanically identical in every sector. But the important thing is that they existed as part of a broader practice. German officers facing the results did not need to know every technical detail of Allied coordination. They only needed to watch what happened after American ground forces made contact and support began to build. Liaison was another crucial element. One reason combined operations fail is that institutions speak past each other. Ground officers think in one rhythm, pilots think in another. Artillery staffs think in grids and timing. Infantry commanders think in terrain and survival. If no one translates between those worlds, cooperation remains clumsy. The Americans invested heavily in reducing that gap. Liaison officers, air-ground communication methods, and procedures for translating battlefield need into usable requests all helped make support more than a theory. The Germans felt the result at the far end. They did not see a perfect machine. They saw a machine working well enough to be feared. And because it worked well enough, it imposed discipline on German behavior. Once an enemy can coordinate quickly across arms, your own mistakes stop remaining small. A truck column exposed in daylight is no longer just careless. It is vulnerable to a chain of response. A reserve force held too close to the front road is no longer just available. It is easier to detect and strike. A headquarters that lingers in an obvious place is no longer merely comfortable, it is potentially targetable. The Americans did not have to destroy everything they saw. They only had to make the Germans live under the possibility that what was seen might be acted upon quickly. That possibility alone pushed German officers toward dispersal, concealment, delay, and caution. This is where logistics enters the story. Coordination is impossible without sustainment. Aircraft need fuel, maintenance, munitions, spare parts, airfields, repair crews, communications, and control. Ground units need their own fuel, vehicles, radio batteries, replacement equipment, and road systems that actually function. Staffs need the capacity to process requests and move information. Liaison systems need continuity. All of that takes material strength. German officers knew this. They were not fools. When they complained about American air-ground cooperation, they were also feeling the pressure of an enemy whose material foundation was broad enough to keep the system alive. This is one reason enemy testimony here is so valuable. German officers were not admiring only battlefield cleverness. They were recognizing the practical result of industrial power shaped into tactical usefulness. That last phrase matters. Industrial power by itself is only potential. It becomes battlefield reality when institutions convert it into timely effect. American production made aircraft possible. American doctrine, training, communications, and staff work made those aircraft relevant to ground combat in ways the Germans could feel. That is the chain. Break any part of it, and the battlefield result weakens. Hold enough of it together and the enemy begins writing bitterly about roads that cannot be used, daylight that cannot be trusted, and local contact that never remains local long enough. The German situation, by contrast, was becoming harsher. This should not be simplified into an easy comparison between competent Americans and incompetent Germans. German forces still contained experienced officers, dangerous local formations, and real tactical skill. Many German units remained formidable under pressure. But their ability to sustain and coordinate responses was increasingly damaged by wider strategic weakness. Fuel shortages mattered, vehicle shortages mattered, disrupted communications mattered. Allied air superiority mattered. The loss of experienced personnel mattered. Headquarters under strain mattered. A system that is losing depth finds it harder to answer fast, and once it answers slowly, the opponent's speed becomes even more oppressive. This is one of the reasons German officers wrote about American fighter bombers with a tone that sometimes blends anger and fatalism. It was not only the aircraft themselves, it was what the aircraft represented. They represented an enemy whose command and support system still had room to breathe. German officers often did not. They were trying to manage retreat, improvisation, shortages, fragmented movement, collapsing reserves, or threatened flanks, while under constant interference from a connected opponent. Under those conditions, every American strength looked larger because German reaction capacity was shrinking. But even that is not the whole answer. Weakness on one side does not fully explain effectiveness on the other. It is still necessary to understand the American confidence that support could be used aggressively. Confidence is not a soft factor in war. Confidence changes tempo. A force that trusts its artillery behaves differently from one that does not. A force that trusts its engineers crosses obstacles differently. A force that trusts its transport pushes farther. A force that trusts its air support can hold on in contact a little longer, call more boldly, and exploit more quickly when the blow lands. German officers repeatedly noticed that American units often behaved as if support was there to be used, not merely admired. That attitude itself is a combat multiplier. There is something almost invisible inside that multiplier: trust between institutions. Armies often divide naturally into tribes. Infantry mistrusts headquarters. Pilots mistrust ground requests. Artillery resents interference. Staff officers distrust field improvisation. These tensions never disappear, but an effective system reduces their ability to paralyze action. American air-ground cooperation worked because enough trust had been built into the process that support could be requested and delivered without every step turning into a bureaucratic crisis. Again, not always, not perfectly, but often enough to matter. German officers were measuring lived effect, and lived effect is what counts. Another part of the American advantage was scale, without total rigidity. Large organizations often become slow because they are large. Yet the Americans managed something very dangerous. They used scale to deepen support without always freezing local initiative. Their command system could be frustrating. Their procedures could be heavy. Their personalities differed widely, yet on the battlefield, enough flexibility remained that local needs could be pushed into the larger machine. That meant the scale of American power did not always sit uselessly in the rear. It could flow forward. German officers were writing about the feeling of that flow. When historians talk about combined arms, the phrase can begin to sound abstract, even ceremonial. Everyone says the words. Few stop to ask what they feel like from the losing side. German writing helps answer that. Combined arms from the receiving end feels like decisions narrowing. It feels like your movements are being priced more expensively than before. It feels like the battlefield refuses to stay one-dimensional. You think you are fighting infantry, and then artillery enters. You think you have found a pause, and then aircraft arrive. You try to regroup, and the regrouping itself becomes dangerous. You move reserves, and the movement exposes them. The battlefield stops granting privacy. That is what the American system increasingly denied the Germans: privacy in action. There is also a time element here that deserves close attention. American air-ground coordination did not simply add violence to the battlefield. It rearranged time. A road that might once have been safe for an hour becomes dangerous in 15 minutes. A reserve that might once have moved before detection is now moving under threat almost at once. A position that might once have been held while awaiting a local solution is now held under the knowledge that the enemy can expand the problem quickly. German officers were writing, in effect, about a battlefield where American systems could shorten the enemy's usable future. That is one of the most powerful things any army can do. Could the Germans still fight well inside that environment? Of course they could. They did. They improvised concealment, night movement, camouflage, dispersal, deception, and local tactical adaptations. They learned, as all pressured armies learn, to survive inside a hostile pattern as long as possible, but survival is not the same as freedom of action. The more German officers had to think first about avoiding American air-ground response, the less freely they could maneuver for purely offensive purposes. Caution was forced into command. Delay was forced into movement. Anxiety was forced into planning. Once that happens widely enough, the enemy's system has already begun winning before the bombs fall. This is why enemy testimony from German officers carries such weight. They were not neutral observers, and no serious historian should pretend they were. But they were expert sufferers of the battlefield effects under discussion. They knew what it meant when a local road became unusable because of fighter bombers. They knew what it meant when support seemed to follow ground contact too quickly. They knew what it meant when daylight movement became a gamble. And because they knew those things professionally, their repeated emphasis on American coordination becomes more than complaint. It becomes evidence of what battlefield pressure felt like when produced by a functioning system. You can reduce the American achievement to machines if you want, but German officers generally did not make that mistake. Even when they wrote angrily about aircraft, their descriptions often point toward a larger reality. Planes matter because someone sees, someone reports, someone clears, someone directs. Someone trusts the process. Someone has built the fuel chain, the maintenance chain, the radio network, the map discipline, the staff habit, and the command expectation that allows the strike to become part of battle rather than theater above it. That is the hidden machinery. That is what made the Americans dangerous. And once you understand that machinery, you begin to see why German officers kept writing in the same emotional key. They were not merely describing bombardment. They were describing the loss of breathing space. The Americans had built a combat method that could keep pressing a local contact outward into artillery, aircraft, and wider movement. They had built a battlefield language in which separate arms could speak to one another fast enough to punish delay. That was the system behind the strikes. And when that system met German troops on the road, in villages, at crossroads, and during withdrawal, the result was not just destruction from above. It was a battlefield that seemed to close around them from several directions at once. Now, the question becomes sharper. If this system was so important, what did it actually look like when German officers met it in the open, on the roads, and at the exact moment movement still seemed possible? That is where the story gets even more concrete, because once American coordination moved from theory into battlefield rhythm, it changed not just what German officers thought, but what they dared to do. All of that structure, all of that communication, all of that hidden machinery only matters if it changes what men see when they step onto a road, enter a village, pull a gun team into position, or try to move reserves through a narrow opening in the line. That is where German officers felt American air-ground coordination most sharply. Not in theory, not in staff diagrams. On the ground. In motion. In interruption. In the sudden collapse of what had looked, a few minutes earlier, like a reasonable plan. A battlefield does not announce that it has become connected against you. It reveals it through small disasters. A column starts too late. A crossroads is used once too often. A group of vehicles pauses because the road ahead is blocked. An infantry position reports enemy armor nearby. A local commander asks for support. A radio message travels. Aircraft are redirected. Artillery is adjusted. Suddenly, the German officer trying to solve one immediate tactical problem finds himself inside a larger sequence he did not choose. That was the real experience many German officers were trying to describe. They were not simply being attacked, they were being folded into an enemy process. Take the road as the first battlefield. Roads in war are never just roads, they are time made visible. Whoever uses them well moves strength, ammunition, food, wounded men, command messages, replacement crews, fuel, guns, and hope. Whoever loses safe access to them loses far more than mobility. German officers in the West wrote again and again in ways that show how deeply American air pressure, tied to ground combat, turned roads into a source of fear. A road under observation is dangerous. A road under periodic air attack is worse. But a road that may become the focus of air-ground response the moment movement becomes obvious is something different again. It becomes a place where command itself starts to thin out. Think about the ordinary shape of a wartime road movement. It is never as tidy as maps make it look. Drivers are tired, vehicles bunch, orders are delayed. Mud, shell holes, civilians, horse-drawn traffic, wrecks, broken axles, and nervous military police all create friction. At the front, that friction becomes fatal because friction attracts notice. German officers knew that once American aircraft were involved, any visible pause could turn into a target. But what made the pressure worse was the feeling that the Americans on the ground and the aircraft above were part of the same watchfulness. A roadblock did not remain only a roadblock. It could become a fixed point. A place where movement stalled just long enough for artillery, fighter bombers, or both to be brought in. This is why so much German testimony about Allied air power is also testimony about paralysis. The visible damage mattered, of course. Trucks burned, half-tracks were struck, guns were abandoned. Horses and men were killed on the move. But underneath the visible damage was the more important effect. Movement itself became morally exhausting for commanders. Not morally in the ethical sense. Morally in the military sense, it wore down nerve, decision, confidence, and initiative. Once you begin issuing movement orders under the assumption that the enemy may be able to react through air support very quickly, every order becomes heavier. You disperse more. You hide longer. You delay departures. You choose worse routes, because obvious routes feel like invitations to disaster, and every one of those choices costs time. German officers felt that time cost in every kind of operation. It appeared in attack. It appeared in retreat. It appeared in reinforcement. It appeared in recovery after contact. A battalion trying to prepare a local counterattack could no longer think only about ground approach routes and artillery cover. It had to think about exposure. A reserve company sent forward in daylight might arrive broken before it ever fired effectively. A gun battery trying to reposition might find that displacement itself had become more dangerous than staying put. Supply officers learned that moving fuel, ammunition, and food was not a rear area activity in any safe sense. It was a tactical gamble exposed to aircraft that might arrive not randomly, but because the front itself was feeding information upward. That last point is central. German officers had lived through air attack before. What increasingly made the American method oppressive was not simply that aircraft were in the sky. It was that ground contact seemed to give those aircraft meaning. If American infantry or armor touched you, the danger did not stay horizontal. It could climb. It could spread. It could return on a wider arc. A position holding against a local attack might suddenly be under bombardment. A movement made to stabilize a flank might be seen and then hit. A road chosen to avoid artillery might attract aircraft. A village defended for one more hour might become fixed long enough for the Americans to reshape the entire fight around it. Villages matter here because they reveal the combined nature of the pressure. A village in Western Europe is not just a collection of houses. It is a tactical knot. Stone walls, narrow lanes, church spires, barns, orchard edges, garden plots, road junctions, cellars, rubble, small rises in the ground. A German officer trying to defend or withdraw through such a place had to think about concealment, anti-tank angles, infantry cover, artillery registration, line of retreat, and communication with adjacent units. Under ordinary conditions, that is hard enough. Under American air-ground pressure, it becomes far worse. Why? Because the village can hold men, but it can also hold them too long, and once they are held too long, the Americans can begin using the village as a target in a larger sequence of fire. This was part of what German officers meant when they wrote about American flexibility. They were not always praising brilliance in the romantic sense. They were often describing the Americans' habit of turning contact into compounded pressure. Infantry fixed, tanks probed, artillery pressed, aircraft entered where movement or concentration exposed itself. The exact order varied. The exact timing varied. Sometimes the air came first. Sometimes artillery dominated. Sometimes weather reduced air activity. But the battlefield effect remained similar enough that German officers kept recognizing the pattern. The Americans did not need every arm present in every minute. They needed enough coordination between arms that the German commander could not count on the problem staying small. Imagine being responsible for moving a reserve company across open stretches between hedgerow lines in Normandy or along exposed roads during later fighting in France, Belgium, or Western Germany. The men are already tense because the front is not stable. They know aircraft have been active. They know enemy artillery may already have the roads plotted. The trucks or half-tracks cannot move too slowly, but they cannot bunch. The company commander wants to get forward before the tactical picture changes again. Then some part of the movement is noticed. Perhaps by troops in contact, perhaps by a forward observer, perhaps by a reconnaissance screen, perhaps by the simple fact that vehicles on a road are hard to hide indefinitely. Once noticed, the danger multiplies. Even if the aircraft do not destroy the whole company, the movement is interrupted. Men scatter. Vehicles turn off. Timetables collapse. The reserve arrives late, fragmented, or not at all. That is what coordination looks like on the ground. Not only destruction, but the theft of coherence. The theft of coherence may be the best single phrase for the battlefield effect German officers were trying to describe. Coherence means movement arriving when intended, fire supporting where needed, decisions linking to action before conditions change. Coherence is the difference between a reserve and a crowd on trucks, between a withdrawal and a rout, between a gun line and abandoned equipment. American air-ground coordination repeatedly attacked German coherence, sometimes with bombs, sometimes with strafing, sometimes simply by making any attempt at coherent movement feel unsafe enough that German officers had to disperse, conceal, delay, and improvise until the original plan was no longer fully a plan. This is also why German officers wrote so intensely about daylight. Daylight is not just brightness. In war, it is permission. If you can move in daylight, you can use more roads, bring forward more supply, recover vehicles, reorganize units, evacuate wounded faster, shift headquarters, observe terrain, and exploit opportunities before they fade. If daylight becomes dangerous, your usable day shrinks even if the sun still rises. American air-ground coordination helped shrink the German usable day. Troops could still move, yes. Commanders still took risks, yes. Desperation forces motion. But every movement by day was now shadowed by the possibility that visible activity might be punished quickly enough to matter operationally. Notice the word operationally. That is important. It is easy to tell stories about air attack by focusing on cinematic moments. A dive, a strafe run, an explosion, men in a ditch. German officers certainly remembered those, but what makes their writing especially valuable is that many of them were trying to explain the operational consequence. Air-ground coordination did not merely create fear. It affected tempo, it delayed reinforcement, it slowed retreat, it disrupted concentration, it forced road discipline changes, it made dispersal necessary. It increased fuel consumption because routes became longer or more circuitous. It stressed communications because units broke into smaller elements to reduce vulnerability. In other words, it did not just destroy things, it rearranged how the battlefield could be used. That is most obvious in retreat and regrouping. Retreat is one of the hardest operations in war, even under favorable conditions. Units are mixed. Rear guards must hold while others move. roads become crowded. Wounded accumulate. Staffs must choose what to save and what to abandon. Signals are overloaded. Discipline matters more than ever because panic can turn distance into catastrophe. Under American air-ground pressure, German officers found retreat becoming not merely difficult, but visible. And what is visible can be shaped. A retreating column is long. It contains vehicles of different speeds and values. It has command vehicles, horse teams, guns, fuel trucks, motorcycles, ambulances, and men on foot. Hit the right point, and the whole line snarls. Then every minute of delay increases vulnerability. That is what a connected enemy system can exploit so efficiently. German officers knew all of this in practical terms. They knew that once movement broke down on a road, the consequences spread backward and forward. A burning vehicle is not only a loss, it is an obstruction. Men leave vehicles to take cover. Drivers hesitate. Officers dismount to restore order. Radios are lost or damaged. Ammunition may explode. Medical evacuation halts. Units behind the strike must either wait or seek alternate routes. The alternate routes may be worse, unknown, or already crowded. If aircraft return, the disruption deepens. If artillery joins in, it deepens faster. This is how one strike becomes an operational event. German officers were not exaggerating when they wrote as if roads themselves had become battlefields, because under American air-ground pressure they had. The same pattern appeared in local counterattacks. German doctrine and battlefield habit placed enormous weight on restoring a line quickly after penetration. Counterattack, even with improvised force, was often the first instinct, but counterattack requires concentration. It requires movement. It requires some confidence that units can gather, form, and strike before the opportunity closes. American air-ground coordination made that increasingly dangerous. A local German counterattack forming in daylight risked being seen before it gained momentum. Vehicles moving into an assembly area risked attracting attention. Even infantry moving across exposed ground could no longer count on the battle remaining only an infantry battle. German officers began to face a recurring problem. Any effort to restore control could itself become the trigger for broader American response. There is a brutal logic in that. The moment you act decisively, you reveal intention. The moment you reveal intention, the enemy gains a chance to coordinate against it. German officers found themselves under pressure from an American way of war that punished visibility. Sometimes the punishment was immediate and spectacular. Sometimes it was slower and cumulative. But either way, it attacked the German ability to convert decision into restored control. And that is why so many later descriptions read with a tone of frustrated compression. The German officer is not only saying, "We were attacked," he is saying, "The very act of trying to regain control exposed us to more danger." Hedgerow fighting in Normandy is a good way to think about this, even beyond that specific place. Terrain of that kind breaks line of sight, channels movement, confuses maps, and makes local contact intense and close. One might assume such conditions would reduce the effect of air-ground coordination, and in some moments they did. Aircraft could not solve every problem in enclosed terrain, but that is not the point. The point is that where movement had to emerge onto roads, where reserves had to pass through openings, where guns had to displace, where villages or road junctions tied the local fight together, air-ground coordination became decisive again. German officers confronting the Americans did not experience the battlefield as either close combat or air power. They experienced it as a place where close combat and air pressure could be linked often enough to distort everything around them. And when the terrain opened up, the pressure intensified. Once German vehicles or reserve formations had to cross more exposed spaces, the risk increased sharply. A commander might delay movement until dusk, then discover that delay had already cost the chance to counterattack effectively. He might move earlier and lose cohesion under attack. He might disperse more heavily and find that dispersed units arrived too late or too weakly coordinated to matter. Every option carried a price, and American air-ground coordination raised the price of the most obvious choices. That constant pricing of movement may have been the most psychologically corrosive effect of all. Most battlefield decisions are not between good and bad, they are between bad and worse. The job of a commander is to pick the bad option whose cost can still be survived. German officers facing American coordination increasingly found that the obvious survivable option kept disappearing. Move now? Risk detection and attack. Move later? Risk losing the position altogether. Concentrate force? Risk air and artillery. Disperse it? Risk weakness and delay. Stay in place? Risk being fixed and hammered. Pull back? Risk exposing the roads. In such an environment, even correct decisions look wrong after the enemy begins answering them. That is why the American system did not have to annihilate every German formation to dominate its behavior. It only had to make the German officer feel that the battlefield was connected more tightly for the other side than for his own. Once that feeling becomes habitual, initiative suffers. Initiative is not only courage, it is the willingness to act under uncertainty because you believe the benefits outweigh the risks. American air-ground coordination steadily increased the perceived risk of visible action. German officers still acted. They had no choice, but they acted with a narrowing sense of freedom. Sometimes the effect was almost theatrical in its timing, and those are the moments that survive most vividly in memory. A road movement begins. A frontline skirmish flares. Someone sees dust or engine movement. A request moves upward. Aircraft appear at what feels like exactly the worst possible moment. The strike lands not because the enemy controls time absolutely, but because the American system has become fast enough, often enough, that coincidence begins to feel like design. German officers were deeply sensitive to this. Professional soldiers notice timing. They notice whether the enemy seems merely powerful or powerfully responsive. What shook them was often the responsiveness. There is an important caution here. We should not romanticize Allied air-ground coordination into omnipotence. Weather could ruin it. Terrain could hide movement. Identification was imperfect. Aircraft were not always available. Pilots were not all equally skilled. Ground-air procedures could break down. There were plenty of moments when German units moved successfully, fought stubbornly, or escaped heavy punishment. But none of that cancels the larger pattern. The pattern is what matters, because the pattern is what German officers kept describing. A system that works often enough changes command behavior, even when it fails some of the time. In fact, the uncertainty may make it worse. If you never know whether the aircraft will appear, you must plan as if they might. That uncertainty hangs over every battlefield example. A road column may get through untouched once, the next day a similar movement is caught. A village may hold under local fire for hours, only to become untenable once movement in or out reveals the position. A gun battery may displace cleanly one afternoon, then lose vehicles on the next attempt. This irregularity is precisely what gives coordinated air-ground pressure its special force. It does not need to behave like clockwork. It only needs to remain credible enough to force adaptation. German officers adapted, but adaptation itself cost them speed, confidence, simplicity, and time. The effect on artillery was especially revealing. Artillery is the backbone of controlled violence in modern war. Guns allow a commander to shape ground he cannot physically occupy. But guns need movement, ammunition supply, observation, and communication. American air-ground coordination threatened every part of that chain. A battery that fires too long from one position risks detection. A battery that displaces risks exposure on the roads. Ammunition movement to the guns risks air attack. Observation posts risk suppression. Communications linking the guns to the front can be broken or delayed. German officers facing the Americans increasingly found that artillery could still be dangerous, sometimes very dangerous, but it became harder to sustain and reposition under pressure. That is what connected battlefield systems do. They attack not only the spear point, but the conditions that let the spear point keep functioning. The same logic applied to headquarters. German officers knew that a headquarters too close to obvious roads, too static in one place, or too dependent on fragile communications was increasingly vulnerable. Even if aircraft did not directly strike every headquarters, the constant threat of exposure forced changes in command location, signal procedure, and movement discipline. A headquarters that must move more often or hide more carefully becomes slower. A slower headquarters issues slower orders. Slower orders arrive after the battlefield has changed again. Under American pressure, those delays could be lethal. So once again, the visible strike mattered less than the chain reaction it set off. Seen from this angle, American air-ground coordination was not just a weapon, it was a battlefield solvent. It dissolved the clean edges of German plans. It dissolved confidence in daylight movement. It dissolved the safety of obvious routes. It dissolved the assumption that local contact would remain limited. German officers had to fight inside that dissolving environment. That is why their accounts often carry so much strain, even when the language remains controlled. They are describing war as a place where every effort to restore order is exposed to interruption from above and from the wider American system behind the front. What made this even more punishing was repetition. One bad day under air attack can be endured. One disrupted movement can be repaired. One damaged road can be rerouted around. But repeated disruption has cumulative effects. Vehicles wear out on detours, fuel disappears, sleep declines, drivers lose nerve, officers become more cautious. Wounded linger longer, ammunition arrives later, staff work turns reactive, reserve timing becomes unreliable. Soon the battle is not merely being fought at the line, it is being fought inside the German administrative bloodstream. German officers understood this, and that is why their remarks about fighter bombers so often carry more weight than simple descriptions of explosions. They were describing a repeated injury to the Army's internal circulation. That circulation metaphor fits perfectly. Armies live by circulation. Men, fuel, orders, food, ammunition, and information must move. American air-ground coordination repeatedly attacked German circulation by turning visibility into vulnerability. A road movement becomes a wound. A delayed reserve becomes a missed heartbeat. A headquarters forced to relocate becomes dizziness. A gun battery short on ammunition becomes weakness at the limb. German officers felt the body of their system laboring under pressure, while the American system, by comparison, seemed able to keep moving strength into the fight through connected means. So what did it look like on the ground? It looked like roads that could not be trusted, villages that became traps once held too long, reserve movements that arrived broken or late, counterattacks that advertised themselves while forming, headquarters forced into concealment and movement, gun lines that could not remain comfortably in action, daylight reduced from opportunity to exposure. It looked like every visible German decision carrying the risk of being enlarged by American response. It looked like a battlefield in which the sky was no longer a separate arena, but part of the same conversation the ground forces were already having. And that is why German officers wrote in the language they did. They were trying to put words around an experience every battlefield commander fears, the moment when your actions stop remaining your own and begin feeding the enemy's system faster than you can break contact. The Americans had reached a point where local ground fighting could pull in aircraft, artillery, and wider support often enough to make German control feel temporary, exposed, and expensive. That was the battlefield reality. But German officers did more than describe the reality. They judged it. They left behind remarks, reports, recollections, and post-war conclusions that let us hear how professional enemies interpreted what they were seeing. And when those judgments are laid side by side, something important comes into focus. They were not all saying exactly the same thing, but they were circling the same conclusion. American air-ground coordination was dangerous, not because it was spectacular, but because it made the battlefield itself feel connected against them. German officers did not leave behind one single statement that solves this subject neatly. What they left instead was something more valuable, a pattern of professional judgment. Different men, in different formations, under different battlefield pressures, kept returning to the same cluster of ideas whenever they tried to explain the American way of linking aircraft to the ground fight. They wrote about speed. They wrote about constant interference with movement. They wrote about roads made dangerous in daylight. They wrote about fighter bombers appearing with unnerving frequency once a column, reserve, or gun position exposed itself. They wrote about the Americans' ability to combine pressure from the air with ground action in a way that made recovery harder than it should have been. That pattern matters because it tells us what enemy professionals believed was actually hurting them. The exact wording changes from source to source. Some officers were blunt and irritated. Some were colder and more analytical. Some wrote in after-action language stripped of ornament. Others, especially in memoir or post-war recollection, allowed more feeling into the description. Yet even where tone changes, the diagnosis often stays close. American air support was dangerous because it was responsive. The sky did not feel detached from the front. Movement did not feel private. Delay became punishment. Concentration became risk. Counter-movement became visible. A local American problem had a habit of becoming a wider German one. That is the first key point in the German verdict. They were not merely describing aircraft as destructive machines. They were describing an enemy system that seemed to convert battlefield awareness into rapid pressure. A German battalion commander did not need to admire American theory to know what it meant when a column was caught on the road after contact had already been made at the front. He did not need to read Allied doctrine to understand what it meant when fighter bombers appeared often enough that any daylight movement felt like a wager. The practical result was plain enough. The Americans could link arms together with a consistency that kept narrowing the German margin for safe action. This matters because enemy testimony always has a temptation built into it. Men under pressure often blame whatever feels largest, loudest, or most humiliating. Aircraft are obvious candidates for that kind of blame. They are visible. They are dramatic. They come from above, where ordinary soldiers cannot answer them directly. A historian has to be careful not to mistake emotional emphasis for analytical truth, but the German material on this subject becomes especially persuasive because so many officers did more than curse the aircraft. They connected the aircraft to movement, command, roads, reserves, communications, and battlefield timing. In other words, they were not only venting, they were diagnosing the shape of the pressure. One recurring feature of German testimony is the language of interruption. That word may not appear every time, but the idea does. American fighter bombers and tactical air attacks interrupted road movement. They interrupted the concentration of force. They interrupted attempts to shift artillery or bring supplies forward. They interrupted the hope that a local crisis could be handled locally. This is one of the clearest signs that German officers were thinking in operational terms, rather than in the language of spectacle alone. A burning truck is dramatic. A battalion arriving late because a road was broken under repeated air pressure is operationally serious. A reserve unit refusing to bunch on a road because everyone expects aircraft is not a cinematic image, but it is exactly the sort of battlefield behavior that changes outcomes. Another recurring feature is the language of constant threat. German officers often wrote as if American aircraft did not need to be physically overhead every second in order to dominate decision-making. The possibility was enough. That is an important distinction. Tactical superiority becomes much more powerful once it shapes what the enemy dares to do before the strike even happens. If German officers consistently felt that any exposed movement might draw fighter bombers, then American coordination was already succeeding at the level of behavior. The aircraft became a shadow over command judgment. They forced anticipation. They inserted caution into places where urgency should have ruled. That caution appears again and again in German descriptions of daylight. Daylight movement, daylight resupply, daylight regrouping, daylight concentration, daylight withdrawal, all became increasingly dangerous in ways German officers remarked upon with striking regularity. And once daylight starts feeling hostile, an army's whole internal rhythm is damaged. Wounded evacuation slows. Guns reposition less freely. Command posts become more constrained in where they can sit and how long they can stay. Supply becomes less predictable. Staff work becomes more anxious because timetables no longer depend only on ground conditions. German officers were not simply writing, "The Americans had aircraft." They were writing, in effect, "The Americans had a way of making the day itself cost us freedom." Enemy testimony is especially revealing when it comes from men who were not easily impressed. German officers, especially those formed by pre-war and early war confidence, were not inclined to hand out admiration lightly. Some remained dismissive of their opponents in certain respects even after defeat. That is why their words about American coordination are so revealing. Reluctant respect often carries more analytical weight than generous praise. When a professional enemy keeps returning to the same unpleasant conclusion, he is usually telling you where he felt the real injury. A number of German accounts also reveal something deeper than irritation. They show recognition that the Americans were not relying on one miracle weapon or one isolated battlefield trick. The danger came from accumulation. Aircraft, artillery, mobility, radio communication, and local initiative all reinforced one another. That accumulation is one of the strongest themes running through the German verdict. American air-ground coordination was oppressive because it amplified other strengths already present. If a German unit was pinned, aircraft made escape harder. If it tried to move, artillery and air pressure might combine. If a reserve was sent forward, movement itself became vulnerable. Every arm seemed to increase the value of the others. German officers recognized this, even when they did not phrase it in elegant theoretical language. This is also why their testimony should not be reduced to a complaint about Allied numerical superiority. Numbers mattered enormously, and German officers knew that. They understood they were facing an opponent, with fuel, vehicles, radios, aircraft, and repair systems on a scale Germany could increasingly not match. But many of them wrote in ways that suggest material abundance alone did not explain the battlefield result. What mattered was how that abundance had been organized. A large force can still be clumsy. A powerful air arm can still remain disconnected from the ground fight. The Americans, in the eyes of many German officers, were dangerous because they had made tactical support feel normal, reachable, and quick enough to change behavior. That insight appears indirectly in German remarks about movement by road. Roads were not merely vulnerable because aircraft happened to roam over them. Roads became vulnerable because visible movement could be turned into an air problem through a broader Allied system. This distinction may seem subtle, but it is central to the German verdict. The officers writing about American air-ground cooperation were often describing not random air harassment, but a battlefield in which their own visibility and momentum were feeding enemy reaction. That is what made command feel exposed. The enemy did not just possess aircraft. The enemy knew how to use the front itself to give those aircraft purpose. German officers also noticed the pressure this created on reserves. The reserve is the commander's promise to himself that the situation can still be changed. Once reserves are hard to move, hard to conceal, or hard to concentrate, the commander begins losing more than tactical flexibility. He begins losing emotional control over the battle. Many German accounts of American air activity are, at their core, accounts of threatened reserve movement. That is one reason the tone can sound so strained. A reserve delayed by mud is frustrating. A reserve delayed because it may be struck from the air after ground contact has already revealed the route is something worse. It means the enemy is interfering not just with action, but with the commander's ability to restore action. There is another revealing pattern in German testimony. A recurring sense that American battlefield pressure did not always arrive in a grand, synchronized spectacle. Sometimes, it arrived in layers. An infantry action fixed attention. Artillery complicated response. Aircraft arrived where movement betrayed itself. Armor pushed where disorder had already opened a seam. The order could vary. The exact timing could vary. But German officers often write as though the Americans had a habit of enlarging trouble faster than expected. This matters because it shows the officers were observing a method, not merely remembering isolated moments of shock. When you place these remarks side by side, the German verdict becomes harder to ignore. They were not all using the same vocabulary. They did not all write with the same fairness or clarity. Some were better observers than others. Some wrote closer to the events. Some wrote through the filter of post-war memory, which always brings distortion. Yet the repeated themes remain stubborn. Rapid tactical response, dangerous roads, daylight constrained, fighter bombers as interrupters of movement, American flexibility in calling and using support, ground contact expanding into broader pressure. These are not random complaints scattered across a defeated army. They are a recurring diagnosis. That diagnosis becomes even more powerful when you remember who was making it. German officers were trained to think in terms of movement, concentration, initiative, and control. Their military culture cared deeply about timing, decision, and local exploitation. So when they wrote with particular bitterness about an enemy whose coordination kept damaging those very things, they were speaking from the center of their own professional worldview. They understood exactly what was being taken from them: time, privacy of movement, freedom to concentrate, confidence in daylight, trust that a local engagement could remain contained. They were not only suffering, they were measuring. That is one reason professional enemy testimony can be so useful. It often reveals not what the speaker wants the historian to admire, but what the speaker could not avoid respecting. German officers did not need to enjoy American methods to acknowledge them. Some wrote grudgingly, some wrote with anger. Some made clear that they still considered American troops inferior in certain old-fashioned ways. But then the same voices described a battlefield where the Americans repeatedly used air and ground together to make German decision-making more difficult than it would otherwise have been. That contradiction is historically revealing. It shows that whatever cultural arrogance or battlefield prejudice remained, it could not fully silence the evidence of experience. Still, caution is necessary. Enemy testimony is never neutral. German officers had reasons to emphasize Allied air power and coordination. It could shift blame away from local failures. It could explain retreat in terms more honorable than breakdown. It could magnify the sense of fighting under impossible conditions. Serious history cannot ignore those possibilities. But neither can it use them as an excuse to dismiss the pattern altogether. In fact, the very persistence of the pattern across different kinds of sources suggests that something substantial lies beneath it. Not every remark carries the same weight. Not every post-war recollection is equally reliable. Yet when reports, memoirs, battlefield descriptions, and broader assessments all keep circling the same themes, the burden shifts. At that stage, dismissal becomes less convincing than careful synthesis. A careful synthesis shows that German officers were often reacting to four connected American strengths at once. First, the Americans had the material means to keep tactical aircraft available in useful numbers. Second, they had communications and procedures that helped connect those aircraft to ground need. Third, they had enough local initiative and command confidence to ask for support aggressively. Fourth, they had artillery, armor, and mobility systems that made air pressure part of a larger combined arms sequence rather than a separate display. That combination is what German officers were really writing about. The aircraft got the headlines, the system wrote the history. One of the most interesting features of German testimony is the way it blends physical description with psychological effect. Officers do not merely say that vehicles were hit. They imply, and sometimes state outright, that movement became burdened with fear before the first strike of the day had even landed. They do not merely say roads were attacked, they show that roads became mentally hostile terrain. They do not merely say reserves were interrupted. They reveal that commanders began planning reserve movement under constant suspicion that visibility itself would invite punishment. This psychological layer does not weaken the testimony, it strengthens it. War is not only about what is destroyed. It is about what becomes difficult to attempt. This helps explain why German officers so often wrote with compressed intensity rather than with long philosophical reflection. They were describing battlefield reality in the language of experienced men. They wanted to identify what the Americans were doing that made their own work harder, and what they kept identifying was not simple air attack. It was integrated pressure. Air attack mattered because it arrived where ground action, road movement, reserve concentration, or local exposure had already made it meaningful. That is what gave American coordination its special force in German eyes. It punished the very processes by which armies try to restore order. Professional soldiers are especially sensitive to anything that attacks order. Order is what turns courage into usable force. Order puts guns where they matter, food where it is needed, headquarters where they can command, and reserves where they can decide a crisis. German officers writing about American air-ground coordination were often, in effect, writing about repeated assaults on order. The Americans had found ways to exploit German visibility and movement with support that arrived quickly enough to matter. That meant order itself became vulnerable. A clean withdrawal might become congestion. A reserve move might become fragmentation. A regrouping point might become a target. A local success might become difficult to exploit because the roads behind it could no longer be trusted. There is also a strategic shadow behind these remarks. German officers did not experience American coordination in isolation from the broader decline of the German war effort. Fuel shortages, reduced replacement quality, strained communications, battered transport systems, and shrinking air cover all intensified the effect of American strengths. Some German writings make this explicit, others do not need to. The pressure is visible in the background. The Americans were dangerous because they were coordinated. They were even more dangerous because Germany increasingly lacked the depth to absorb and answer that coordination. This does not reduce American effectiveness to German weakness. It explains why the German verdict sometimes sounds so grim. They were facing a connected enemy while their own system was losing the capacity to remain equally connected. That is why the German verdict should be read in two layers. The first layer is immediate and tactical. The Americans used aircraft in close relationship with the ground fight, making roads, movement, daylight, and reserve action hazardous. The second layer is deeper and more important. The Americans had built a battlefield system in which information, command, mobility, and support interacted quickly enough to squeeze German options. German officers often wrote the first layer plainly. The second layer appears when their remarks are placed together and interpreted as a pattern. And once that pattern is visible, the title of this story begins to answer itself. What German officers wrote about American air-ground coordination was not just praise, not just fear, and not just complaint. It was a reluctant description of modern combined arms warfare functioning with unusual effectiveness. They were writing about an opponent who could take local contact and turn it into multi-directional pressure. They were writing about an opponent who made movement expensive, daylight conditional, and recovery uncertain. They were writing about an enemy system that seemed able to connect men on the ground, to force in the air before German command could fully restore control. That is the heart of the German verdict. Not that American aircraft were invincible. Not that every strike was accurate. Not that every battlefield problem was solved from above. The real verdict is harsher and more significant than that. German officers were admitting, sometimes openly and sometimes through the shape of their complaints, that the Americans had built a way of war in which separate arms could reinforce one another fast enough to reshape enemy decisions. That is what the officers remembered. That is why the remarks recur. And that is why their testimony still matters. Because once enemy professionals begin describing your battlefield method in terms of interruption, responsiveness, and the shrinking of their own freedom to act, they are telling you something larger than who won a skirmish or lost a road. They are telling you what kind of war they felt closing around them. The final question, then, is not simply why they noticed it. The final question is why they remembered it so strongly, and what that memory reveals about the larger American way of fighting in the West. German officers remembered American air-ground coordination so vividly because it did more than kill men and destroy vehicles. It changed the meaning of command. That is the deepest answer to the entire subject. A battlefield is not only a place where weapons meet, it is a place where decisions are tested against time. The officer who can still move reserves, still shift artillery, still send fuel forward, still relocate headquarters, still keep roads open, still get wounded men out, still react before the enemy expands the problem, that officer still possesses a future. The officer who starts losing those things may still be brave, may still have disciplined troops, may still fight stubbornly, but his future begins shrinking. That is what American air-ground coordination kept doing to German officers in the West. It kept shrinking the future. That is why the testimony lingers. Men remember what frightened them. Professional soldiers remember what stripped away their options. German officers had fought many kinds of enemies across many fronts. They had seen artillery concentration, armor shock, urban defense, close infantry fighting, partisan war, bad weather, logistical strain, and retreat under pressure. Yet when they wrote about the Americans in Western Europe, one of the recurring themes was this feeling that battlefield exposure no longer stayed local long enough to be managed. Once movement was seen, once contact was made, once a road filled, once a reserve began to gather, the Americans often seemed able to widen the danger more quickly than expected. That is not just a memory of violence. It is a memory of compression. Their time to recover had become too short, and that compression mattered because modern war is won by armies that can keep converting information into action faster than the opponent can restore order. That sentence may sound abstract, but German officers were feeling it in extremely concrete ways. A road jammed by air attack is information turned into action. A village fixed by infantry and then hammered from outside is information turned into action. A reserve company caught while moving forward after ground contact has already revealed the route is information turned into action. A headquarters forced into repeated relocation because visible patterns risk punishment is information turned into action. The Americans were not only bringing more power to the battlefield, they were bringing more connected power. That is the larger meaning of what German officers wrote. They were describing a combat system in which the Americans had learned how to keep separate arms in useful relationship to one another. Infantry did not need to solve every problem alone. Tanks did not need to break every line unaided. Aircraft did not need to search blindly for significance. Artillery did not need to act as a separate kingdom of fire. Each arm could give the others meaning. Each arm could make the others more dangerous. German officers recognized that because they were suffering not just isolated blows, but linked pressure, the battlefield would not stay single-layered. This is why the old habit of explaining Allied success in the West only through material superiority never fully satisfies. Material superiority was real, and it mattered enormously. A serious history of the Western Front has no business pretending otherwise. The Americans and their allies possessed the fuel, vehicles, aircraft production, maintenance systems, spare parts, munitions, radio capacity, and transport depth that Germany increasingly lacked. But material superiority does not explain itself. It has to be translated into battlefield effect. German officers kept telling us, often more clearly than later summary accounts do, how that translation worked. The Americans turned industrial depth into tactical responsiveness. They turned logistical breadth into battlefield presence. They turned communications and procedure into shortened response time. They turned support into something expected rather than exceptional. That is why the memory lasted. Another reason it lasted is that American air-ground coordination attacked one of the most cherished assumptions of command culture. The belief that skilled officers can still carve out a space for deliberate control under pressure. German officers had been trained in a military tradition that prized decision, initiative, and local judgment. They believed, with reason, that disciplined leadership could recover a bad situation, seal a breach, shift reserves, improvise a defense, or restore a line before disaster spread. American coordination repeatedly made that harder. It did not make German leadership useless. It made leadership more exposed to forces outside its immediate control. The commander could still decide. What he could not always do was prevent his decision from becoming visible, vulnerable, and punishable very quickly. That distinction is crucial. Defeat feels one way when the enemy simply smashes through by overwhelming force. It feels another way when the enemy keeps attacking the processes by which you would normally recover. Many German officers remembered American air-ground coordination so strongly because it seemed to assault recovery itself. Movement to stabilize a line became hazardous. Movement to feed a local success became hazardous. Movement to retreat in order became hazardous. Movement to reposition guns became hazardous. In a sense, the Americans were not just contesting German actions, they were contesting German second chances. That is one reason roads occupy such a large place in the memory of the campaign. Roads are where an army reveals what it is trying to do next. They reveal retreat, reinforcement, resupply, concentration, displacement, confusion, and ambition. German officers experienced roads becoming treacherous, because the Americans had built a system that could often reach into that exposed bloodstream. It was not necessary for every road to be under constant attack. It was enough that the possibility remained active, credible, and frequent. Once that happened, the road ceased to be neutral terrain. It became a place where decision and punishment might meet with very little warning. The same goes for daylight. Daylight is usually an army's ally. It allows commanders to see, drivers to move, engineers to work, medics to evacuate, quartermasters to sort, and staffs to orient. The Americans did not abolish daylight for the Germans. They did something more practical and more destructive. They made daylight costly enough that German use of it had to be renegotiated constantly. That renegotiation wore down every level of command. A regiment cannot function normally when routine movement must be treated like a tactical problem. A division cannot function normally when resupply and reserve timing are shaped by fear of visible exposure. An army cannot function normally when daylight itself begins to feel like a pressure advantage held by the enemy. German officers remembered that feeling because it invaded the ordinary work of war. This is also why the subject cannot be reduced to fighter bombers alone, however famous they became in memory. Fighter bombers mattered. Their physical and psychological effect was real. But German officers were often remembering a larger pattern. Fighter bombers came to symbolize an American ability to connect battlefield awareness to immediate punishment. That symbol mattered because it stood for a whole method. Radios, forward observers, staff routines, command confidence, logistical depth, mobility, standardized procedures, and air availability all stood behind the visible aircraft. The plane diving onto the road was only the visible edge of a much larger structure. German officers sensed that structure even when they lacked the language to describe every part of it cleanly. This helps explain why the memory survived beyond the individual strike or march. Men forget details of one shelling and remember the shape of a whole campaign. German officers kept remembering American coordination because it was not merely an event. It was an environment. It shaped when they moved, where they moved, how they dispersed, what they feared, how they concealed, how they assembled reserves, how they placed headquarters, and how they judged risk. Once a battlefield method changes the enemy's behavior at that many levels, it leaves an unusually strong imprint on memory. It becomes part of how the enemy understands the war he fought. There is also a moral dimension to this memory, though not in the sentimental sense. War rewards armies that can make their systems work under pressure. German officers, whatever else one says about them, recognized competence when they suffered under it. They may have resented the Americans. They may have underestimated them in other respects. They may have filtered their memories through defeat, bitterness, or self-justification. Yet many still wrote in ways that reveal a hard truth. American success in the West was not just the result of men and machines existing in large numbers. It was the result of those men and machines being connected in ways that made battlefield support repeatable. That repeatability is what professional enemies notice. They do not only notice what is spectacular, they notice what keeps happening. What kept happening was this. German movement exposed itself. American systems often reacted fast enough to matter. German attempts to restore control drew broader pressure. Daylight use narrowed. Reserves became harder to commit cleanly. Roads became operational liabilities. Headquarters felt less secure. Artillery displacement and resupply became more dangerous. The battle stopped respecting clean boundaries between front and rear, between local contact and wider consequence, between the platoon's immediate fight and the theater's deeper machinery. German officers remembered American air-ground coordination because it erased some of those boundaries for them. That is why the title promise leads to a larger verdict than the title alone first suggests. What German officers wrote about American air-ground coordination was, at one level, a record of battlefield frustration. At another level, it was a record of historical recognition. They were witnessing a mature form of combined arms warfare, backed by industrial power and made flexible through communications and procedure. The Americans did not invent combined arms. They did not solve every battlefield problem elegantly. They were not flawless in execution. But in the West, they reached a point where air and ground could cooperate often enough, and forcefully enough, to shape enemy behavior beyond the immediate point of contact. That is what the German officers were really remembering. And when you think about it from the ground up, that memory becomes even more human. Picture the ordinary German soldier or junior officer caught inside this system. He is not thinking in doctrinal language. He is thinking about staying alive, getting the truck through, finding the platoon on the flank, keeping contact with the company next door, dragging ammunition forward, locating the battalion command post, getting a wounded friend onto transport, waiting for dusk, listening for engines overhead. Yet all of those small human acts are being shaped by the larger fact that the Americans can connect arms against him with disturbing speed. The system is strategic at the top, but it is lived at the bottom. That is why it leaves such a deep mark. It reaches the nervous system of the battlefield. This is one of the most important lessons hidden inside the German testimony. War is not decided only by heroics, or only by weapons, or only by the brilliance of a few famous commanders. It is often decided by whether ordinary units can draw on extraordinary support quickly enough to matter. The Americans were increasingly able to do that. A company under pressure might not be special. A platoon in a hedgerow lane might not be elite. A tank crew holding a road junction might be exhausted, frightened, or inexperienced. Yet if those men remained connected to artillery, aircraft, transport, engineers, and higher command through a functioning system, they became more dangerous than their local numbers alone would suggest. German officers understood this with increasing clarity. They were not merely fighting the Americans in front of them, they were fighting the Americans attached to them. That phrase may be the best final summary of all. The Americans attach their wider power to the local fight. That is what German officers kept writing around, even when they focused on roads, fighter bombers, delay, or movement by day. The local American unit did not stand alone for long if communication held and support was available. The battlefield was built to thicken around it. More fire, more observation, more mobility, more pressure. The Germans could still fight brilliantly in places. They could still improvise. They could still sting, delay, and defend. But the Americans kept making local German success harder to convert into something larger, because the Americans were often faster at making local contact mean more. So why did German officers remember American air-ground coordination so strongly? Because it was not just another Allied advantage. It was a way of war that reached into every attempt they made to recover control. It attacked their roads, their reserves, their timing, their daylight, their headquarters, their artillery, and their confidence that a problem could remain contained. It turned visibility into vulnerability and movement into risk. It made the sky feel connected to the front, and the front feel connected to a much larger machine. The memory survived because the method worked often enough to reorganize the enemy's habits. And that is the final verdict. German officers were not really writing only about airplanes. They were writing about a battlefield system that allowed the Americans to move from contact to response with punishing speed. They were writing about the loss of breathing room. They were writing about what it feels like when an opponent's information, firepower, logistics, and command habits begin reinforcing one another faster than your own can recover. In the end, that is why their testimony still matters. It shows us not just who had strength, but who knew how to connect strength to time. If you want more WW2 stories that explain how battles were really shaped beneath the surface, subscribe and stay with me for the next one. Because the men writing those reports and recollections were telling us something larger than who controlled the sky. They were telling us what happens when war stops arriving one weapon at a time and starts arriving as a system.